Do you have a favorite horror comedy? There's movies like American Werewolf in London, Shaun of the Dead, the Evil Dead sequels, but there's one that I feel like a lot of people forget, and that's what I'm talking about today. Return of the Living Dead was released in August 1985, directed by Dan O'Bannon. Now, I won't go into detail about the rights issues for the Living Dead franchise. Just know that George Romero and John Russo split the rights. So John Russo is one of the writers of this film, has the right to the Living Dead name, which is why this movie is called Return of the Living Dead, but it isn't directly related to the Living Dead films prior, like Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, or Night of the Living Dead. Although this movie does have a connection to the original Night of the Living Dead. Now, I don't remember exactly when I first saw this movie. It definitely wasn't in 1985. It had to be in 86 or 87 on cable. I do remember it being on cable quite a bit. That would have put me around 8 or 9 when I first saw it, and I loved it. I loved every scene of this movie. My previous favorite funny horror movies were American Werewolf in London, Ghostbusters, and Gremlins. Although an American Werewolf in London was more scary to me than funny at the time, because when I first saw it, I think I was like 4 years old. So yeah, that movie just scared the piss out of me. But anyway, let's get into Return of the Living Dead. Well, our film starts out in a medical supply warehouse in Louisville, Kentucky. This is where we meet 3 of our main characters, Burt, Frank, and Freddy. Freddy's played by Thom Mathews, a year before he'd be the best Tommy Jarvis in Friday the 13th, Jason Lives. Now, something I never noticed until doing this review was the long take right at the beginning of the film, when Frank is giving Freddy his OJT for his new job at the medical warehouse. It's shot in a way that makes it seem like someone's watching them from behind the shelves. Soon after, we meet Freddy's punk rocker friends, all with their own distinct looks and personalities. But I'll talk more about them as the story progresses. Next, we get the scene that sets up the events for the entire movie.
Let me ask you a question, kid. Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
This conversation leads Frank to take Freddy down into the basement to show him a barrel with a body in it, after he claimed that the movie Night of the Living Dead was based on a true event and that there was a military cover-up. Well, Frank, being a bit of a show-off, smacks the barrel, it causes a leak, and a bunch of noxious gas escapes, knocking out Frank and Freddy. We're then greeted with a cool-ass intro theme and the opening credits for the movie. Right after the credits, we first meet Colonel Glover, who's apparently been waiting to hear about these barrels for years.
But when will you find them?
Christ, Ethel, I don't know.
Now at this point, we've met all but one of the main cast, and Freddy's friends are on his way to his job to pick him up when he finishes his shift. In the meantime, they want to go somewhere and party. We cut back to Freddy and Frank, and they're feeling all the effects of the trioxin gas that they breathed in. Now, we saw during the credits that the trioxin gas has the ability to reanimate dead flesh. But what does it do to live flesh? This is honestly where we get a lot of the comedy in this movie. Our 2 main characters are 2 bumbling idiots who are also living and dead at the same time. Now, at this point, Freddy actually has the right idea and wants to call the number on the side of the barrel. But Frank talks him out of it, saying he doesn't want the army around there. So they calm themselves down and they call their boss Burt. Now, before we get to Burt, we got to talk about what might be the most infamous scene in this movie. The character Trash, played by horror movie legend Linnea Quigley, does a full frontal striptease that I obviously can't show any meaningful part of on YouTube. But if you're curious, it's definitely worth a watch. Now back to boss man Burt. He shows up to try to help these 2 idiots deal with the now living cadaver locked in the freezer, in an honestly hilarious scene that could have been ripped straight out of a Three Stooges movie. They all soon realize that each individual part of the reanimated body is alive, and removing his head and limbs won't kill it. So now they have to come up with a new idea. This is where we meet the last important cast member, Ernie. He's a mortician, and he's probably a Nazi, or at least a Nazi sympathizer. You see, Burt had the brilliant idea of burning the dismembered cadaver, and his friend Ernie happens to have a cremation furnace, although this idea would turn out to be a huge mistake. Now the trioxin has been unleashed on the graveyard and the surrounding areas in the form of acid rain. As the contaminated rain seeps into the ground, it reanimates all the corpses in the graveyard. Meanwhile, Frank and Freddy's condition seems to be getting much, much worse. This is when they finally reveal to Burt that they breathed in the trioxin gas. So they decide to call some paramedics because they absolutely need help right now. Getting back to Freddy's crew, when the acid rain started, they had to seek refuge somewhere. Most of them made it back to the car, but Freddy's girlfriend Tina had gone into the medical supply warehouse prior, looking for Freddy. This is where we're greeted with another iconic scene in this movie, the introduction of the Tar Man. I should also mention that zombies eating brains wasn't really a thing before this movie. So in that respect, it's an innovator. As Tina attempts to escape the Tar Man, the rest of her friends come inside out of the rain. And this is where we get the first zombie kill in the movie. 46 minutes in, halfway through the film, the character Suicide gets his head bitten into. As improbable as that is from a physical standpoint, it's still a cool kill. Now the paramedics show up to check on Frank and Freddy, and they both come to the same unbelievable conclusion. These guys are dead. At this point, Freddy's friends have made their way back to the graveyard, and now they're running from the freshly emerged zombies. But Trash doesn't make it. The rest of Freddy's crew splits up, and some of them end up finding Ernie's place.
Freeze! You're dead! Don't shoot you! Are you crazy? Are you on PCP?
Naturally, Ernie was a little on edge, but he lets the crew in. The last two members of the crew make a run for it towards the medical warehouse. Now our paramedics have gone outside to get stretchers, but they hear a bunch of people screaming and yelling. This is where we get our next two victims. Both paramedics end up as zombie food. As Ernie checks on the paramedics and finds the bodies, he rushes back inside and lets the crew know, we need to call the police. But all the phone lines are down and the zombies are starting to overrun the building. Now, Return of the Living Dead also established the talking smart zombies. They can plan and set ambushes. One of them gets on the paramedics radio and calls for backup. Most of our crews barricaded themselves in, and Freddy and Frank are basically walking corpses. When the backup paramedics arrive, the crew realizes they're in a worse situation than they thought. Our next victim is the character Scuzz, played by Brian Peck, and if you've seen that Nickelodeon documentary on Netflix, you know who this guy is. Anyway, with that scumbag now out of the way, the crew manages to capture one of the zombies. Now in a cool and pretty funny scene, the corpse starts to explain the motive for the zombies, like why exactly they want to eat brains.
The pain of being dead.
Now, for all the reasons that I love this movie, there is one major continuity issue. You see, Trash comes back as a zombie, even though we saw her get eaten earlier, which I could excuse if she had like chunks of meat taken out of her and bite marks everywhere, because the rain was still falling and I could see that her corpse would be reanimated. But then, wouldn't the paramedics' corpses be reanimated and the paramedics that responded? Like, this part doesn't really make a lot of sense. But no movie's perfect, so who cares? By this point in the film, the crew in the mortuary has pretty much figured out the only way they're going to escape the situation is through. They need to send a couple people out to get one of the cars, bring it back, pick up everybody, and try to escape. But that doesn't work out. Not to mention that our boy Freddy is now a full rampaging zombie. So Burt and Miguel Nunez's character Spider hatch a plan to make a run for the car, while Ernie and Tina stay inside and try to barricade themselves in. However, there's way too many zombies piling on the car to pick up Ernie and Tina, so they have to turn around and go for help.
You can't just leave them!
Then turn the goddamn car over and we'll send help.
Burt and Spider end up crashing into the medical depot, where they meet up with Chuck and Casey. Now we cut back to the mortuary, where rampaging Freddy is trying to find Tina, and Ernie decides they'll be safer in the attic. Frank, with his remaining human consciousness, decides he'd rather just be a pile of ash than a rampaging zombie. And there's a whole story behind why this scene actually came about. He was supposed to film a scene out in the rain where he's rampaging and killing people or something, and the actor himself was sick and miserable, and he just said, hey, how about I just cremate myself? And it turned out to be one of the best deaths in the entire movie. Now the police finally show up, but it was a trap, and they end up getting ambushed by a ton of zombies, so they were basically useless. After spotting a helicopter outside, the crew decides to make a phone call to let someone know they're trapped inside. But the only working phone is downstairs in the basement with the tar man. So Burt quickly comes up with a plan to dispatch it so they can get to the phone. Burt manages to call for help, but soon after, all the police are overrun by the zombies. Then he realizes he needs another plan. Now Burt decides to do what they should have done at the beginning of the movie and call the number on the side of the barrel, although the eventual outcome probably would have been the same no matter what. This is where we finally see Colonel Glover again, and apparently the military has an entire contingency plan for this situation. And of course that plan consists of nuking Louisville, Kentucky. And there you have it. In a movie that's so humorous, it has a really depressing ending because literally everyone dies. Listen, if you've never seen Return of the Living Dead, do yourself a favor and watch it. It is available on streaming for free on Tubi and on Pluto. Give it a watch before they remove it for whatever reason. It's a really great movie. The sequel isn't quite as good, but it isn't bad. And the third one is like, I'm not sure about that. But this one, the first Return of the Living Dead, is excellent. It's a great movie to watch during the Halloween season, and it's just a good time. So once again, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give me a like, give me a subscribe, make a comment, and I'll be back with more soon.